A Carolina crash. Hurricane Hugo roars ashore with 135-mile-an-hour winds and heavy rain, bulldozing its way through the coast, then blasting a path of destruction far inland. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. A large part of South Carolina was officially declared a major federal disaster area today after a brutal early morning pounding by Hurricane Hugo. Buildings were flattened, streets flooded, homes washed away. South Carolina's governor called it the worst disaster he'd ever seen. The hurricane scored a direct hit on Charleston, doing heavy damage all along the lowland coast. Total death toll in the Carolinas, at least 10, most right in the Charleston area. Hugo then stormed upward, far inland, into Charlotte, North Carolina, still packing hurricane-strength wind. The hurricane's whirlwind trip northward over land sapped most of its strength. Hugo was downgraded this morning to officially a tropical storm, and tonight it's just another weather system, bringing some wind and rain to the north, but nothing like the reign of terror in the south. As predicted, the hurricane made landfall at about midnight Eastern Time last evening. Here's a sample of the sound and the fury. Those 135-mile-an-hour winds and the heavy rain took their heaviest toll right around Charleston. The hurricane blew in at high tide and, as had been feared, sent a wall of water, sometimes 20 foot high, rushing as far as 10 miles inland. CBS News correspondent Richard Schlesinger is on the scene. Richard?
Dan, good evening. The damage here in some parts of this area was appalling. There were some buildings that were not just destroyed, they vanished. This is what 135-mile-per-hour winds and 17 feet of water can do to a place. The barrier islands off Charleston were chewed up and spit out by Hugo on his way to the mainland.
Right now it's a mess. They've got power lines down. There's no power, no water, no phones.
President Bush has declared the region a disaster area. The National Guard has been called out to help the overburdened police. The islands off Charleston were cut off when the bridges were mangled. Emergency workers went by boat to see the destruction firsthand. What was here?
This used to be the landscape office. It was a building that was on that structure. And where that went, your guess is as good as mine.
John DeBagian spent the night hunkered down inside his house on Sullivan's Island in the middle of the hurricane.
It was a whooshing sound. That's all you could hear. It was whoosh and continuous whoosh.
DeBagian insists he wasn't scared. He risked his life because he couldn't find a hotel that would take his dogs. Hugo's blunt power caused erratic, sometimes peculiar damage.
I prayed and I asked the Lord if he wanted the furniture, well and good, but please save me without any injuries.
The storm saved Mrs. Robinson's furniture, but took the walls. All over Charleston, Hugo changed the landscape. A restaurant here yesterday is gone today. A tranquil oceanfront neighborhood transformed overnight. And Hugo also changed the way people around here view hurricanes. A police officer on one of those islands told me for 10 years the weathermen have been predicting that a major storm could hit here, that this area was overdue for a major storm. No one believed them. Hugo made a lot of believers last night. Dan?
Thank you, Richard. In the 300 years since its founding, Charleston has survived both weather and war. The Civil War began there. It's the kind of place where you kind of expect Scarlett O'Hara to step out of a doorway. Beautiful homes from the antebellum period still line the old downtown streets. But as Aaron Hayes reports from Charleston tonight, Hurricane Hugo did damage of historic proportions.
The restoration here will not be easy. hundreds of years of history have been flattened, broken, altered.
Well, I'm trying to get hold of contractors and carpenters and clean-up people to start cleaning up even today, if we can.
It's scary. Don't want another one like this one having 30, 40 years.
Hugo's damage ran the range here, from broken roofs to broken lives. Alberta Ferguson was living with her brother. Their house collapsed in the hurricane last night. He was killed.
The house was dark, and I would just calling him, and he never answered me.
The city of Charleston is itself in trouble. No electricity here for days, maybe weeks. Order is being guaranteed by guardsmen with rifles. People here, especially those who chose to stay through Hugo, are still shaken today by the storm's fury overnight, the sight at dawn. 82-year-old Nora Reels refused to leave her house. Safe today, she's not quite so certain a hurricane is something to be stubbornly resisted again.
But it's the worst I have ever seen it. And I've been here nearly all my life.
There is a sadness here, a disbelief.
I didn't imagine that it could do this much damage. It's amazing.
We'll pick up and we'll try to put pieces back together as best as we can.
It was the power of the storm that took most of them by surprise, the way a single night could so permanently alter their city. But cleanup efforts began right at daybreak, and Charleston's mayor says Hurricane Hugo will not have the last word here.
We look forward to the opportunity to rebuild this city quickly.
The mayor has instituted a citywide curfew from 7 tonight till 7 in the morning. He's also told merchants here he'll deal harshly with anyone inflating prices to take advantage of hard times in coming days. He's asked the National Guard to stay on a while, put some of his own police in riot gear, a precaution, he says, a signal that Charleston will get through this without chaos. Dan?
Aaron Hayes, thanks. 75 miles up the coast from Charleston, the Myrtle Beach vacation area of South Carolina was laced with somewhat less wind than Charleston, but it got a lot of rain and rising water. It was spared the full destructive force of the hurricane. CBS News correspondent Frank Courier is in Myrtle Beach.
Hugo's assault pounded northward up the Carolina coast to Pawleys Island, beginning of a 60-mile-long resort strip called the Grand Strand, where elegant houses were devastated.
I guess I should be happy that it's not completely gone. We saved the furniture upstairs.
A lot of these houses, like right back here, don't even belong there. This house is sitting where they never sat before.
The hurricane ripped this house from its foundation, shoving it 250 yards across a swamp. At Georgetown, the second floor of this brick motel was sheared off. And at Garden City, what's left here was the beginning of a dream for Linda and Gary Blake.
It's also an ending to many dreams.
I mean, whatever I got left is right here.
But at Myrtle Beach, where evacuees were finally allowed to return this afternoon, they found their beach town remarkably intact.
And we do have some extensive damage, there's no question about that, but it's not as bad as it could have been.
Because of lessons learned by Killer Storm Hazel 35 years ago, when most of this area was destroyed and later rebuilt to tougher standards, much of the Carolina Grand Strand has survived the wrath of Hurricane Hugo. Frank Courier, CBS News, Myrtle Beach.
And still to come on the CBS Evening News, Bruce Hall on the brute power of the hurricane 200 miles inland. And we'll talk to weatherman Neil Frank about that. And Gary Reeves on the mystery of the crash of that U.S. air flight. Carolina report that the damage from Hugo and its hurricane force winds there was the worst in at least 30 years, maybe 35 or 40. Most residents had never seen anything like it, and correspondent Bruce Hall tells us many were stunned with surprise. They never expected to see it today. Bruce?
Dan, people here were genuinely surprised. Charlotte is 200 miles inland, and no one here expected the full force of a hurricane to hit this city. Hugo was still packing 90-mile-an-hour winds when it rammed Charlotte shortly before dawn, the first hurricane ever to hit this inland city. Thousands were rousted from homes and hotels, including many who had come from the coastal areas, thinking they would be able to escape the fury of the storm.
Well, it's definitely not what anyone expected up here. We all thought we were too far inland to get this type of weather.
When the wind and rain stopped, residents could not believe the damage. Roofing and glass littered the streets. Windows were blown out of downtown skyscrapers. Streetlights and metal signs spun around and around.
It's terrible. It's a mess. It's like this all over. It's bad.
Century-old oaks were split in half by the storm, their leaves stripped away by the wind. Power transformers and electrical lines were strewn along sidewalks and streets. Homes and cars were crushed by debris.
Things are pretty bad out there. We still don't know the degree of the damages.
Tonight, Charlotte has been declared a disaster area, and the cleanup is underway. Residents are still asking the question, how the storm could still be packing such a punch this far inland.
Oh, I've always heard that Charlotte was just far enough out from the mountains and far away from the coast that we didn't get any really serious storms. But we got fooled, didn't we?
It's going to be another long night in Charlotte. The city is expected to be in darkness. The power company saying it will be several days before they can restore electricity to all of the community. And residents here are now familiar with the full force of a hurricane. Dan?
Thanks, Bruce. Joining us now is Dr. Neil Frank, our meteorologist and hurricane expert in Houston. Dr. Frank, can you understand the surprise of the people in Charlotte?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I think the common thread throughout this storm is everybody said, well, I just don't understand. I didn't know hurricanes could be this bad. Well, we're dealing with a Category 4 on our scale of 1 to 5, and you haven't had a Category 4 storm on the South Carolina coast this century. I think the surprising thing to me is how fast the winds decreased. You realize that by the time the storm reached Charlotte, that's only 8 to 10 hours later, and the winds had dropped by half. The storm hit the coast with about 135-mile-an-hour winds. By the time it got to Charlotte, they were down to 70, 75. I know there was some gusts to 85 or 90 miles an hour, but it lost 2/3 of its strength in an 8-hour period. Maybe we need to re-examine our building codes.
Were you surprised that the loss of life, so far as we now know, was so low?
Well, Dan, what I've heard now, and it's very gratifying, apparently people did respond to the advice to get out. And I think that speaks well for the education programs that we have along our coastline today, and that's particularly true there in North Carolina.
Thanks, Dr. Frank. And we'll be back with the day's other news in a moment, so stay here with us. Of Wednesday's aborted takeoff of U.S. Air Flight 5050 from New York's LaGuardia Airport deepened today. Gary Reeves reports that with a lot of questions still to be answered about the accident that left 2 passengers dead, federal officials took action today against the cockpit crew.
The Federal Aviation Administration today suspended the licenses of the pilot and co-pilot of the U.S. Air jet that crashed late Wednesday. In published reports, the co-pilot described the pilot as mumbling and irrational before the failed takeoff. Now local prosecutors have started their own investigation.
They told us that there could possibly be some kind of criminal activity and involved, and for those reasons that they wanted to interview them.
The FAA called pilot Michael Martin and co-pilot Konstantin Kleisev no longer qualified to fly an airliner due to circumstances related to the accident. The two were asked to take drug tests before talking to the National Transportation Safety Board investigators. Flight attendants on board U.S. Air Flight 5050 came to the pilot's defense.
The captain was with me at this time, assisted me as much as he could.
U.S. Air denies published reports that the crew lacked experience flying 737s, but exactly who was at the controls during the crash is still a mystery. One veteran 737 pilot who wishes his identity hidden says inexperience can be deadly.
All of the new generation aircraft are very complex. They require a lot of specific training for each and every model of those aircraft.
Experienced pilots agree the high-tech cockpit of the 737 can be confusing. On LaGuardia's wet, short runway, they had only a few seconds to decide to stop.
Of course, we practice it in the simulator, but those are controlled conditions and you're prepared for it.
Conditions at the crash site were too windy to raise what's left of Flight 5050, slowing an investigation that has raised a lot of questions, but so far provided few answers. Gary Reeves, CBS News, New York.
The Airline Pilots Association issued a statement tonight saying the performance of the U.S. Air pilot and co-pilot was not unusual, that no federal rules were broken, and the crew, it said, cooperated completely with the investigation. In another sign of continued economic growth, the Commerce Department reported today that Americans' personal spending was up 0.9% last month, and personal income up 0.4%. That jump in spending was the biggest since April. Lodge in Wyoming today, Secretary of State Baker and Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze talked for several hours. Then Shevardnadze talked up some movement on arms control. State Department correspondent Bill Plant has more on the scenic setting for these talks and what's going on behind the scenes.
Posing against the grandeur of the Teton Mountains, Secretary of State Baker and Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze made the most of their scenic backdrop, talking of the new openness in relations between the two superpowers.
I think we'll have an announcement for you before we leave about a general time frame for us.
Sources say that means sometime in the first half of next year. The relaxed atmosphere was reflected in jokes over a pair of courting moose spotted in a nearby meadow.
Let's see.
Last night, I did some hunting for moose.
But the foreign minister appears to be after even bigger game, a strategic arms control agreement. After an initial one-on-one meeting of almost 3 hours between the two men, the Soviets revealed that they have agreed in principle to a U.S. proposal for trial verification, a plan which could open hundreds of nuclear weapons sites in both countries to unprecedented snap inspections, if it is applied to all long-range weapons systems of both nations. Soviet officials say the two sides will also agree to exchange information on major military maneuvers. U.S. officials chose to ignore the discussion of arms control. They focused instead on issues such as Soviet bloc arms sales to Nicaragua and Afghanistan. The Soviets make no secret of their priorities, saying that it's time for a speedy agreement on a long-range nuclear weapons treaty. The Bush administration prefers a much broader, more low-key approach. The reason? Lack of domestic political pressure for arms control and lack of agreement inside the administration on such difficult issues as Star Wars. Bill Plant, CBS News, Jackson Hole.
The Irish Republican Army struck again today in Britain its deadliest blow in some time. 10 members of the Royal Marine Band were killed and 22 others wounded in what the IRA said was a response to what they call British Prime Minister Thatcher's message of war in Northern Ireland. Bill McLaughlin is on the scene.
It was the worst terrorist attack on the British mainland in more than 7 years. A devastating early morning blast tore apart a Royal Marines recreation barracks in the coastal town of Deal, killing and wounding members of the military band. Firemen, some with special detection cameras, joined Marine rescue teams tearing at the rubble with bare hands, desperately searching for survivors. The explosion rattled homes surrounding the barracks, smashing windows and ripping off roofs. But no civilians were seriously hurt.
I ran up here to see if my dad was all right, you know, because he's 84. But he's lucky he's all right, and the window fell in.
Anti-terrorism experts believe this bombing was the work of one of the IRA's so-called English units, small teams of expert bomb makers with a secret base in England.
This is just the latest in a new round of IRA attacks that began last year. Tougher security measures are enforced tonight throughout Great Britain. But there are charges that security at the Royal Marines Music School, provided by a private company, was haphazard.
Well, I mean, we see them climbing over the walls. Well, where's the guard?
But terrorist experts warn there's no way to completely protect against IRA attacks.
As the IRA has itself said, the Brits need to be lucky all the time. We only need to get lucky once.
During her visit to Northern Ireland last week, Mrs. Thatcher praised British troops for the job they were doing over there. But over here, the IRA continues to be deadly. Bill McLaughlin, CBS News at the Royal Marine Barracks, Deal.
There is some renewed hope for peace in Lebanon tonight. The leader of the Christian forces there, Michel Aoun, accepted an Arab League plan designed to end the fighting that has killed more than 800 people since March. Muslim factions backed by Syria had already endorsed the plan for a ceasefire followed by negotiations on political reforms. Colombia's Justice Minister Monica de Graef resigned today. Colombia's drug thugs had issued repeated death threats against her, her husband, and 3-year-old child ever since she took the job 2 months ago. Several former justice ministers received similar threats in Colombia. One was assassinated in 1984. Another was shot and wounded in 1987. De Graef said she resigned at President Baco's request because, she said, he needed another type of person in the ministry. Well, if you saw it, it seemed like it was tailor-made for President Bush's anti-drug speech to the nation earlier this month. Mr. Bush holding up a bag of crack he said was taken during a drug deal right near the White House. Turns out now it was tailor-made, literally. Law correspondent Rita Braver reports how it all went according to the White House script.
Remember when the President of the United States launched his new drug offensive, showing the world what could be bought right on his street?
This is crack cocaine, seized a few days ago by drug enforcement agents in a park just across the street from the White House.
Well, what Mr. Bush didn't say was that the legend of the Lafayette Park crack was born only after the White House called the Justice Department to ask if there was any such stage prop available. The Justice Department called the Drug Enforcement Administration, which had a case going in the neighborhood. And as first reported by the Washington Post, the DEA obligingly agreed to move the buy a little closer to the White House. The only hang-up was that apparently the teenage drug dealer didn't know exactly where the White House was. He finally found it, and the president got a 3-ounce cache to flash.
Well, it makes you wonder whether the creative energies of the president and his people aren't more aimed at show business than at the kind of tough policies that we really need.
In Kennebunkport, the president was not apologetic.
I said I'd like to have something from that vicinity to show that it can happen anywhere. Absolutely. And that's what they gave me, and they told me where they caught this guy.
You don't think that the DEA was being used by the White House here?
Absolutely not. I think that we helped the president send a message to the American public.
Meanwhile, the DEA said it had not apprehended the suspect yet because it still hoped to buy more drugs from him. But with the story out now, officials say they'll move to indict and arrest him if he's still around. Rita Braver, CBS News, Washington.
And that's part of our world tonight. Dan Rather for the CBS Evening News. Bob Schiffer will be here tomorrow evening, and also tomorrow, the premiere of Saturday Night with Connie Chung. That's tomorrow night at 10, 9 Central Time. We wish Connie luck and naturally hope you'll watch.
Second-ranked Michigan on the Wolverines' home turf. Now, number 1 Notre Dame opens at home against Big Ten power Michigan State tomorrow.
This is CBS.
Just ahead on 11 News, a bus crash in